have made it to Unit 4, and in Unit 4 we are going to talk about photosynthesis, cellular respiration, and all those processes that kind of work all together. But first, let's kind of step back a little bit and talk a little bit about how all organisms feed. Now, this is important to understand because all organisms have to feed. They all need to receive nutrients somehow in order to gain energy to do the things that it needs to do. Both unicellular cells along with multicellular organisms, they all need to feed in some way. So all organisms need to take in many different substances to their bodies to make new parts, repair old parts, or even to use in order to release energy. Now, metabolism involves using that energy to build molecules or breaking down molecules in which energy is stored. Now, every cell and every organism goes or has some sort of metabolism. There's always something there that uses energy or builds molecules, breaks them down. Now, to do this, nutrition is something that needs to be eaten by certain organisms or feeding. So nutrition involves the taking in of nutrients, which are organic substances and mineral ions, and they contain raw materials for growth, tissue repair, absorbing, assimilating other organelles. A lot of things go into this. So it's not all just about food and eating, as this picture, bread. It's about taking in the nutrition that particular organism needs. Now, animals and fungi cannot make their own food. We've discussed this before. So the chemical energy and organic compounds that animals and fungi eat can be transferred to organic compounds or to organisms that consume food. So the chemical energy, let's say from plants, actually goes into heterotrophs, us. And so those organisms that must get energy from food instead of directly from sunlight or inorganic substances are called heterotrophs. So you and I, we are heterotrophs. The mushrooms that you ate on that pizza, heterotrophs. They also cannot make their own food. So to do this, specifically for plants, let's say, plants must use the energy from the sun. They also use some inorganic compounds, such as carbon dioxide and water, and they make glucose, which is a sugar. Now that sugar is what's used to then eventually, it will be eventually broken down into energy. So the glucose itself is the sugar. And as you see, my computer needs to restart. So taking a look here, we have carbon dioxide and water. These are our inorganic substances. Now the C6H12O6, this is an organic substance. This is made of carbon, something that all living things are made of. And that's why it's considered organic. Now, not everything with carbon is considered organic. For instance, carbon dioxide here, this is inorganic. So we have to be careful not to say that all things with carbon in it are organic. But in this case, all living organisms do have carbon in it. Now, directly or indirectly, almost all the energy in living systems needed for metabolism comes from the sun. So if we take a look at this little picture here, we do have the sun. The solar energy is being absorbed by special organelles in leaves. As we've discussed, they're chloroplasts. This transfers itself into chemical energy. Those plants are eaten by other things such as grasshoppers. Those grasshoppers are eaten by frogs, and then the bird will eat the frog. So as you see, that tracing back all the way to the sun, that's where we get the original energy from. So directly or indirectly, all organisms actually do get energy from the sun. Now, photosynthesis is the process that plants go through in order to make those glucose or to manufacture those carbohydrates. So photosynthesis is the process by which plants manufacture carbohydrates from raw materials using energy from sunlight. And we've already discussed here that the carbohydrates, this is glucose. And these raw materials are those inorganic substances such as carbon dioxide and water. When those combine, then we do have glucose that is formed. Organisms that use energy from sunlight or from chemical bonds in inorganic substances to make organic compounds are called autotrophs. Basically, the fancy word for those organisms that can make their own food. Thus, plants, for instance. Now, take a look at this little image that's going to come up and just kind of think to yourself, jot down in your notes, what do you think is happening here as we look at the Elodea plant underneath bright light? Now, pretty fascinating, huh? What do you think those bubbles were? As we saw, it was kind of time-lapsed, so that's something that happened over a long period of time, but what do you think those little bubbles were? Think about it as we kind of go through this, the rest of this video. So we know, because photosynthesis is taught earlier in grades, plants convert light energy into chemical energy. So this process is called photosynthesis. So that light energy from the sun eventually gets converted to chemical energy, and that's in your food. So when we're talking about photosynthesis, we actually have 3 different stages. Now, we're not going to go into detail for each particular stage, but do know that the process is a lot more complicated than what you see here on this slide. But for the sake of this video and for what we need to know for this course, this is it. This is what we need to know for photosynthesis and the 3 stages. So in the first stage of photosynthesis, this is where energy is captured from sunlight, and this is typically done in the chloroplasts of the cell. And specifically, the chlorophyll is what captures that sunlight. Now, stage 2, this is where the light energy is converted to chemical energy, and it's stored in a couple things called ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate, and this is just a fancy way of calling it energy, and something else called NADPH. Now, NADPH also is a form of energy. Now, when I say this, it really means that energy is found in the breaking of the bonds. So it's not that there's like big energy molecules. Once bonds are broken in these situations, that's where we find the energy. Now in stage 3, and this is where the chemical energy that's stored in your ATP and your NADPH powers the formation of organic compounds using carbon dioxide. So we have a few things going on here. And again, it's much more complicated than just what's here on the screen, but this is a good beginning of where you need to be. So photosynthesis, as I mentioned, occurs in the chloroplasts of plant cells. And these structures contain light-absorbing substances called pigments. And I mentioned chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is one of those primary pigments involved in photosynthesis. Now, the reason why we see leaves as green is because the chlorophyll absorbs mostly blue and red light, and it reflects that green and yellow, which is why we see green, because it's reflected off of those particular organs or organelles. So we see the green light instead of the blue and red because those blue and red lights are actually absorbed. Now we have 2 types of chlorophyll. We have chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. And as we'll see here, they kind of give off a different, or they they get absorbed at different wavelengths. So if we take a look here, we have chlorophyll B. Chlorophyll B actually is it absorbs more of the blue-green kind of area, whereas chlorophyll A will actually absorb more of that orangey and red area. So the pigments that produce yellow and orange fall leaf colors, these are called carotenoids. Now, carotenoids also produce the colors in fruits and vegetables, such as like yellow peppers or red peppers. So carotenoids absorb wavelengths of light different from those absorbed by chlorophyll, as you can kind of see here. Now these carotenoids here, it's going to absorb more of that green, which is why we see more of those fancy colors like reds and oranges and yellows on different fruits. So taking a look at this chart, it's very interesting to see chlorophyll A and B and the carotenoids. This is the one that, these are the colors that light is actually absorbed. So that's why we don't see those colors, because they're absorbed, not reflected. And finally, we have photosynthesis. Now, this particular equation is very important for you to know. It is tells you the whole story, but behind it, don't forget, there's a lot going on. It might look very simple, but with this whole process, it's very, very complicated. But again, for the purposes of this course, we don't really need to go into complicated. So during photosynthesis, organisms will build molecules from those substances in their environment. And to do this, sunlight is definitely needed. So on the left side of this equation, these are your reactants. This is what is needed in order to produce the glucose. So we need 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, and we need 6 molecules of water. That's what these big 6's mean. And once we mix that with sunlight, we're going to get 1 molecule of glucose and 6 molecules of oxygen. So what's on the left of this equation are your reactants. On the right are your products. Those are what gets created.